course, there's probably some sense of truth there. But again, I think the end times city that's going to be destroyed is probably not Rome itself or the Vatican. It's more likely going to be some other location. But I'll let Pastor Anderson kind of give his thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest mistakes that you can make when interpreting the Bible, especially with Bible prophecy, is thinking that only one interpretation is correct, when the Bible is very deep and there are layers and layers of meaning, and it's going to have different applications at different points in history. And so is it the Roman Empire? Yes. The first century AD Roman Empire, the Caesars? Yes. Is it the Roman Catholic Church? Yes. Is it the United States? Yes. Because these are just different ways of interpreting it that are all legitimate. Now, obviously, these things are ultimately going to actually happen in real life. And then we ask ourselves, okay, what place is literally physically being destroyed? But when it comes to preaching the spiritual truths from Revelation 17, you could apply this to different places at different points in history, because it's just a Babylon spirit. And of course, in our film Babylon USA, obviously we go into this in great detail. I've done a lot of sermons. If you just go on thepreaching.com, that'll take you to our church's sermon page, and just search like find on page, Control F, Command F, and just look for the word Babylon. And I've done a bunch of sermons on this, sermons on Revelation 17. It's a complicated subject. And at the end of the day, when the old IFB is constantly preaching that this is the Roman Catholic Church, I would say amen to that. And obviously in Babylon USA, we show all the reasons why America appears to be the end times Babylon, if Christ comes, in the near future, within the next 50 years or whatever, who knows? But yeah.
Does that kind of answer your question?
One right answer.
Yeah. Do you like that answer, Nate?
Yeah, absolutely. I did have one more tiny question, if you don't mind. I was wondering, and this one's for Pastor Anderson. I was wondering if I could have a Catholic prayer read.
Get this bozo off the phone.
Yeah. All right, that's how you get dropped off the line. All
right. God bless.
Thanks so much for calling in. And I think we have another caller that's got a similar question, so we can bring him on. Tony from California, I think, was also wanting to ask something in this same vein. Tony, can you hear us? Hey, Tony, how's it going? Can you hear us?
Tony.
I just went to you.
Don't do this to us.
Yeah, I can hear you good.
All right, there he is. All right, we got you loud and clear. Where are you from?
Sorry about that. I'm from California. I've met you guys at Verity Baptist Church at the Red Hot Preaching Conference.
Great.
It's not like we're best friends or anything, but
why not?
We've met.
What?
Just kidding.
I thought this whole time, I thought we were. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, so I mistakenly had a sister relay a message to Pastor Anderson for me before on the destruction of Babylon, but I didn't form a question. And Pastor Anderson, called that out pretty quick, and he's like, he didn't even ask a question. He's kind of just rambling on, something to that effect. But here's the question. Is it possible that in Revelation 14 and in Revelation 18 that it is chronologically correct and that Babylon has fallen at this point prior to the rapture, just God's wrath hasn't been poured out on Babylon yet? What are your thoughts?
I would just say no. I remember reading that message, and I did read everything that you had to say and looked up the scriptures and thought about it. And, I personally don't buy it. I think that the mention in Revelation 14 is a little bit puzzling. Obviously, the Bible is filled with things that are puzzling, but I think it's crystal clear that after the 7 vials of God's wrath are poured out, that's when, Babylon comes in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And I do think that the destruction of Babylon and the fall of Babylon are synonymous. I think that chapter 14 is just simply foreshadowing a lot of things that are going to happen. And the other thing I would point to in chapter 14 is, the treading of the winepress of the wrath of God, which I believe that treading of the winepress is sort of just picturing the entire period of God pouring out his wrath, which takes years to do. And yet it's all being foreshadowed there in chapter 14. So God is just making a pronouncement like Babylon is done, even though he hasn't physically done that yet. That's what I think. I could see where you were coming from. I read what you had to say, but, personally, I don't buy it.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the conversation was that y'all had or his viewpoint, but I have recently preached through 14. I'm on Revelation 21 now, but when I talked about Revelation chapter 14, I kind of parlayed with chapter 18, where it says in verse number 2, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Of course, I think it's valid to interpret this statement of is fallen as in the sense of like maybe it's impending doom, or just the prophetic aspect of what God's saying. But I think another possible interpretation, and this is one that I had suggested in my sermons, was the idea of Babylon being fallen in a political sense, or in the sense of its infrastructure, or it's been taken over, because it's kind of being mentioned here as it's like almost like a demonic force has basically entrenched itself and taken over the country. And sometimes people say like America is fallen, even though we're still here intact, but they're just because we have Joe Biden as our president, or because things are on the decline, or it's kind of the essence of something about to be destroyed because of the fact that it's been taken over. And, sometimes they'll talk about like Rome has fallen, or some empire has fallen, even though it's technically not over yet. It's in the sense that it's been taken over politically, or maybe it's kind of done for. And I use this analogy of just the idea of like if you were driving a car and you drive off of a cliff, well, there's this period of time before you go from the top of the cliff to the bottom, and you're in this falling state. And so like in a sense, perhaps Babylon's in this quote fallen state of, yeah, it's been taken over. It's on its path of destruction. Nothing's going to stop it whatsoever. And so you could even say technically that it's accurate that it is fallen. I think that is a possible interpretation. Again, I don't know what you provided.
So here's why. The reason why I don't buy that, though, is just because, like, if you go back to Jeremiah 51, which is what Revelation is referencing.
Yes.
I'll just read verse 8. It says, Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. So it's like the fall and the destruction are kind of in the same breath. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Or like if you go to Isaiah 21, Babylon is fallen, and all the graven images of her gods he hath broken under the ground. So I feel like the fall of Babylon is synonymous with the physical destruction that's taking place in chapter 18. And obviously the verse in chapter 14 is a problem, for my view in a sense. But the reason that it doesn't keep me up at night is simply just because of the fact that, a lot of times the scripture is just foreshadowing. And because later in chapter 14, there's for sure foreshadowing when the cluster of the vine of the earth is cast into that great winepress of the wrath of God, and all the blood comes out. I don't think that's talking about a specific event, but rather it's just foreshadowing what's coming. God's wrath in general. The fall of Babylon's coming. I just think those things are being announced in advance. But
yeah, I mean, either way, it doesn't really matter entirely, but yeah. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for calling in.
Do you mind if I just a little follow-up on that?
Sure, go ahead.
I know there's a lot of people waiting. Just a little follow-up. So in Revelation 18, it says, in Revelation 17, it talks about the abomination of desolation, just like it talks about it in Revelation 14 or 13. And then we have Babylon is fallen. And then the next thing that should be on the timeline is the rapture. I think we'd all agree. If it was on a timeline, And I noticed in Revelation 18, after it mentions Babylon falling again, in verse 4, and this is the part that's really sticking with me, and it's because of Pastor Anderson's Revelation series, that really enforces it, because in Jeremiah 50, verse 9, it says, their arrows shall be as of mighty expert men, none shall return in vain. So I think that this is what's happening with the destruction of Babylon, the fall of Babylon. But in Revelation 18:4 it says, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and ye receive not of her plagues. So this, to me, seems like this seems like another rapture passage. People are being raptured out of Babylon, so they're not partakers of the plagues. It's mentioning all of them. And it says, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. So it's like in Revelation 18 where Babylon comes back in a remembrance. I'm sorry, Revelation 16, where Babylon comes back in a remembrance of God at the seventh vial. So that was my thought, and I was just kind of curious, in its totality, what you thought.
Yeah, again, not buying it, and I'll tell you why, because this is one of those things where if you just look at this one particular issue, you're just looking at these couple of verses and saying like, hey, this can work. This is great. But the problem is when you try to plug this in to the greater scheme, it's going to be super confusing. You're going to be jumping all over the place. You got too many raptures happening at too many times, two different places. I've worked out a coherent timeline of how these things work. And, another similar thing that people would bring up is the last trump in 1 Corinthians 15. Obviously at face value, we want the last trump to be the seventh trumpet, because that would be super clean, super convenient. And I think that would make the most sense. But then if you try to actually plug in the rapture at the seventh trumpet in the book of Revelation, it simply doesn't fit, because it causes a whole bunch of problems in a whole bunch of other places. So, you have to have a holistic view of these things and have a fully developed scheme here for understanding this. And if you're putting the rapture in chapter 18, it's just not going to work, because there's a clear chronology taking you from 16 into 17 into 18, and it's clearly happening in order. And, the rapture just simply doesn't take place after God pours out his wrath. And so, that's one of the reasons why I'm not buying it,
Yeah, I totally agree with Pastor Anderson's timeline. And he made a chart that's like a Daniel 70th week chart that I think is really helpful for kind of looking. I also made a chart. You can find it on purewordsbaptist.com. If you go to the End Times tab, it has a chart. And this is actually, my chart's a little different than his, just in the sense that this is just a chronology. It's a sequence of events. So you can't really judge like the time, like the amount of time based on it. Pastor Anderson's is great because you can even kind of see maybe more of a semblance of the actual time, but mine's more of a sequence of events.
Mine's like to scale chronologically.
Right, yours is a lot more scaled, but because there's so many events towards the end, and I kind of wanted to still illustrate them really clearly, mine's kind of more just in the sequence. But you can tell clearly that the rapture is in Revelation chapter number 14. And so if you look at the chart in the second coming of Christ, which is the seal 6, you can see that it's in chapter 6, and then you can see that it's also in 14 down kind of towards the bottom of that chart. And then you have all these other events. Revelation chapter 15, they're in heaven. You see them, kind of that great multitude that's in heaven. Then you go through all the 7 trumpets and the vial judgments. And then after that is when you have this judgment of Babylon, which is really basically one of the last events. You kind of have, based on my chart, and again, I believe this is what the Bible's clearly laying out, is you have the destruction of Babylon, then you have the Battle of Armageddon, and then we're ushered straight into the millennial reign of Christ. And these things are happening in a very short space. The judgment of Babylon is about an hour. And you essentially just have pretty much on the same day, you have, in my mind, kind of like that ending of Babylon, Battle of Armageddon, and then you're kind of ushering into Christ is returning with all of us onto this earth. To say that that's the rapture would really to disagree with the post-trib, pre-wrath rapture, because you would have to go through the wrath And you would have kind of like a strange view in Revelation chapter 14 and Revelation chapter number 6. So even if you do believe, like I do believe that it's possible to interpret Revelation 14 as Babylon has fallen in that timeline, and say that in Revelation 14 it's fallen in the sense that, yeah, it's like Joe Biden's our president, and we have basically our entire government's been co-opted, and America's just basically doomed and destroyed, and it's the habitation of every unclean bird, and like that is a possible interpretation that I believe in. And that still wouldn't change the timeline of the rapture or the destruction of Babylon whatsoever. And it is certain that Babylon will be destroyed in a short space, like in a 1 hour time period, when God does finally judge it through the 10 kings. Do you have an opinion on this, Ben?
I almost wonder, was the caller trying to say that the scripture in Revelation 18 where it says, "Come out of her, my people,"
Is the rapture?
is a callback to the rapture in Revelation 14? Was that his point, or did I misunderstand completely? Is that what you got out of that?
Are you still there?
Oh, he's gone.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I was confused. I think, again, when I taught on that was essentially that's just the people that got saved after the rapture, and they need to leave Babylon, because this is what I said. As soon as Babylon's destroyed, like virtually the same day or the next day, in my view, is going to be the millennial reign of Christ. Well, if you're physically nuked off of the planet, you're not going to go into the millennial reign of Christ. So it makes sense that whoever may have gotten saved during that period of time to say, like, hey, you need to leave here because it's about to be nuked. And if you want to enter into the millennial reign, physically, then you basically can't live here because it's going to be destroyed. Kind of like Noah got on the ark, or Lot was pulled out of Sodom. You can't necessarily stay in these places because they're going to be destroyed physically. And so he's just kind of giving that one last warning. Or a Christian that was in Jerusalem in 70 AD, it's kind of like a hint, wink, wink, get out of here. But why would God have to tell you, hey, get out of here, he's going to rapture you? Like, what does that matter? Like, I'm going to do anything. Like, let's say I do get raptured. I'm not having to do anything physically. I'm going to just be caught up in the air. Like, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Like, I don't have to prepare for the rapture or something. Like, I'm not having rapture training.
You have to shave your head, and you have to drink a certain flavor of Kool-Aid.
Yeah. Well, that's Jim Jones's rapture, I think. But no, I thought that was good. I want to get someone on the line real quick because he's calling internationally. We got somebody from the land down under. We want to try and get on the line. It's Andrew, I believe, from Australia. Let's see if we can get him on the line from the land of Oz. Hey, Andrew, how's it going?
Good. How you going?
Great.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks for calling in.
I've been listening to Pastor Stephen Anson since 2014, and I just thought I'd call up and say hi. And thanks for everything, but I won't tell you my testimony story because it has something to do with Ken Hovind, so I don't want to...
Do you want to talk about the moon or what?
No, I was actually just going to ask your guys' thoughts on the whole red heifer thing, and then I realised you've got a debate coming up. So I just wanted to hear Pastor Stephen Edmondson's view on, because I don't understand what's going on, and I heard something about rebuilding the temple on Al-Aqsa Mosque. I just wanted to hear you guys' views on that.
Thoughts on the red heifer?
All right, Pastor Anderson, here's your chance.
I mean, I think that the red heifer is like the biggest nothing burger ever because, it has like no end time significance at all. And, I don't want to steal the thunder of Thursday. And honestly, like, I didn't even know anything about the red heifer until I heard about this live stream with Pastor Jimenez. And I asked Pastor Jimenez, like, so what is the red heifer? I'm like, what is that? I don't even know what verse that is. Because it's like one obscure verse from the book of Numbers that mentions it. And so I looked it up and read the chapter, and I'm just like, what the? I mean, so I don't have any thoughts. What do I think about the red heifer? I don't.
Well, I feel stupid because I'm like, I don't know what this is, and I don't know what the big deal is.
Me too. I thought I was the only one.
None of us can figure out what the big deal is. But I'm sure these rabbis or Judaizers are going to bring up all kinds of dumb stuff, and I'm sure it's going to be fun to watch Pastor Jimenez and Pastor Shelley deal with them. But
Yeah, absolutely.
if you're wondering what, if you're wondering what it's about, you're not alone.
Okay.
Because I'm wondering.
I
too.
honestly thought I was. I was like, there's this controversy, and I have absolutely no idea it even existed.
Well, I think again,
Well, that's
most of
what
the
I want to-
controversy is about sacrifices rather than just the red heifer specifically.
Oh.
But
right.
yeah,
Okay.
Well,
That's why I
wanted
think
to
it's
call
going to
up
be
and
an
realize-
interesting show.
Go ahead, Pastor Anderson.
Oh, sorry. There's like a delay, so I'm not trying to cut people off. It's just
Yeah.
like a delay thing. I was just going to say I think it's going to be an interesting show just because it's just going to be a lot of end time stuff. It's going to be Judaism versus Christianity, Judaizers, and these different things. I'm not saying that it's not going to be an interesting show. I'm just saying that this red heifer thing is made up. It's just a fabrication. It's not a real thing that actually biblically matters to us in the New Testament. That's all I was saying.
Is there any link? Is there any link to like the building the temple thing? Like, how does that all link up? Because I'm confused.
I think you just need to wait till Thursday. I think you got to hang in there for like 48
this was
more
a
hours.
shameless promotion.
This is great.
You're probably going to learn more about the red heifer than you can imagine like 48 hours from now. So let's just wait for that.
Let's just put him on hold until Thursday.
Well,
night.
I've got some good Australian red shorts that I'll wear on the day. So.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much for calling
Thanks a
in.
lot, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, God bless you. Have a good night. Or day. I don't even know what time it is.
It's-
It's probably morning for
Yeah,
them.
morning.
Yeah.
It's like next week over there.
It's next week. Almost. Well, we still got a lot of callers, and I just wanted to prioritize somebody from Australia because I know that it's a little more expensive to call internationally. But I think we have another Brandon that we can bring in on the line from Tennessee, it looks like. Braden. I think I looked at that wrong. Do we have a Braden from Tennessee that we can bring on the line?
Yes, sir. How you doing?
Hey, how's it going? Did I get your name? Is it Braden?
Yes, sir.
And where are you from?
Chattanooga, Tennessee.
I couldn't tell from the accent. So, what's your question?
I was just wondering if you or Pastor Anderson could see any biblical event in the Bible, if you could be there to watch it happen, whether it be the flood or something out of Revelation or any event, Elijah calling fire down from heaven, anything, what would it be and why?
That's a tough question.
I mean, that's tough, but just knee-jerk reaction, I guess, just the amount of transfiguration with, Jesus and Moses and Elijah. I mean, because then you're kind of getting a 3-for-1 there, and you're kind of hanging out with 3 apostles too. So I mean, that's kind of like a one-stop shop. You got Jesus in his most glorified form. You got Peter, James, John, Moses, Elijah. There's a lot going on there.
That was a good answer. My initial thought was Genesis 19, and then I realized I didn't want to turn into a pillar of salt, and so I feel like I have to change my response. But I think something cataclysmic like the flood would be just kind of interesting, just to kind of see like how that even worked, I guess. But honestly,
the flood is kind of a long movie though, because like the whole thing takes like 40 nights. Or
it might be boring.
Yeah, it's a little long.
You're just watching water,
rain.
Yeah, you can't even see anything. It's just like when. What about you, Ben? Do you have something you'd like to see?
I'll say, what about the creation itself? That'd be cool to watch if it was possible somehow.
Like, wait a minute. Did you not want to see rocks shooting off of the earth and hitting the moon?
That's specific. That's why I said creation, because I want to see the rocks. Well, that would have been
that was
flood.
the flood.
Sorry, that was the flood.
I was going with the flood.
Sorry. Yeah, actually, yeah, you're right. The flood. Maybe I'll change my answer to the flood so I can see the rocks shooting out like missiles and hitting the moon.
Did you have one, Braden? What was your pick? You thought about this more than we did.
I don't know. I think it'd be cool in Revelation to hear the cherubim and everybody screaming, "Worthy is the Lamb." I think that'd be neat.
Well, all the future stuff you still get a chance to see, so there you go.
Get a chance to see, yeah.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
Well, thanks so much for calling in, Braden. God bless you. Have a good night. I want to go to another caller here. Troy from Wisconsin, I believe we have in the chat. Hey, Troy, how's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
My name's Troy Highland, and I'm from Rice Lake, Wisconsin. And I had a question in 1 Peter 3, talking about basically what I'll be sticking to is verse 19 in 1 Peter 3, where it says, "By which also you went and preached unto the spirits in prison." And I know that the Abraham's bosom thing is just a Jewish fable, and I don't believe in that. But I've heard, me personally, I reference this. I believe it's kind of like a reference to Isaiah 42, where it says, and I'll just go there quick. I had a bookmark, but then it disappeared. Oh, there it is. It was a nail. That's why I couldn't find it. But it says in Isaiah 42, verse 7, it says to open. I'm kind of cutting into it, so I'm trying not to take anything out of context. But it says in verse 7, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. And for more context of who the people in the prison house are, in verse 22 of the same chapter, it says, "But this is a people robbed and spoiled. They are all of them snared in holes, and they are hid in prison houses. They are for a prey, and none delivereth for a spoil, and none saith restore." In this chapter, if you actually read it, I think kind of talking about how he's going to bring the blind by a way that they knew not, lead them in paths that they have not known. Talking about bringing Jesus into the picture and salvation, because I believe it mentions the Gentiles in that chapter. But my view on it is that he's just preaching to people that are lost, or maybe the lost sheep of Israel. But I have a pastor who's a great pastor, and I love him. I come from an old IFB church myself called Northwest Baptist out of Shell Lake, Wisconsin. Soul Winners and such, they're a great church. But he said, and it kind of made me think, and he said, because I'm a Sunday school teacher there too for adults, and I preached on Abraham's bosom. I actually was allowed. I asked him if I could preach something against it, and he said I could if I gave both sides of it, and I did. And I don't know if I changed his mind or not, because he said that Jesus did go to hell, and that's where he preached the spirits in prison, so to speak. And I'm like, well, at least he's saying that Jesus went to hell, and not to Abraham's bosom, which is a step forward, not backward. But I just wanted to know what your guys' thoughts on that were when it comes to him preaching the spirits in prison.
I'll let you go ahead first, Pastor Anderson. Give your thoughts on that verse.
Yeah, so when you interpret this passage, obviously you have to look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and 1 Peter chapter 4, because he gets off the subject in chapter 3, and then he gets back on it in chapter 4 again. I did a sermon on this super long time ago, 16 years ago or something. It was called Baptism and the Flood is the name of the sermon. If you want to go back and listen to an archaic sermon from 25-year-old Pastor Anderson preaching about this. But, I would say that, that you're right, that it's talking about, preaching to unsaved people. Also, another way of looking at it could be that he preached to the people, to the spirits in prison, before they went to prison. I could say, I preached to that guy in prison. It doesn't necessarily mean I preached to him in prison. It means I preached to that guy, and that guy's now in prison. And so there are a few different ways to read this. But I think that the key thing to understand is that when we're talking about people who were disobedient before the flood, and while the long suffering of God waited while the ark was preparing and so forth, and then when you go to chapter 4 and it talks about how, the gospel was preached to them that are dead, I think it's what it's saying there is that the gospel was preached to those who died physically, because it says, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God and the Spirit. I think it's a similar wording to like 1 Corinthians 5. You know, like the destruction of the flesh, that the Spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. And again, it's a difficult passage, but in that sermon, I explain how basically what's going on is that the Word of God, the gospel, was preached while the ark was being prepared before the flood, and many people got saved, and so they went to heaven, but they still physically died. Okay? And so, you know, I was taught my whole life, oh, Noah preached for 120 years and he had 0 converts. You know, nobody got saved. That doesn't make any sense to me because, you know, God's word has power. The gospel has power. And anytime the gospel's preached, anytime the word of God is preached, people are going to be saved. So I don't believe for one second that Noah preached and had 0 converts. And typically people who like that doctrine are people who have 0 converts. They like that doctrine because then they can relate to that version of Noah who doesn't get anyone saved because they don't get anyone saved. I think that just because someone drowned in the flood doesn't mean that they weren't saved spiritually. You know, they physically died. And obviously, even a saved person right now, if they're living a sinful life, God might kill them. You know, if I went out and, you know, got drunk and committed adultery and did all these big sins, you know, God could cause me to get in some car accident, like, because he just wants to take me out before I do more damage to the cause of Christ. And so, you know, I personally believe that, you know, these people were preached to before they died. Okay. I do not believe for one second that Jesus Christ went to hell and preached to dead people in hell and that those people got saved. Because to me, that's just bizarre that you would think that people are getting another chance to be saved after they're already dead and burning in hell. Because, you know, the problem with that is that what kind of an idiot would just be like, no, thanks. I'm not going to believe I'm not going to get saved. I think I'm just going to stay in hell. You know,
True.
Because people will be like, well, he's just giving people a chance to be saved. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure if you went to hell right now and do a soul winning marathon in hell, I think everybody's going to get saved because nobody wants to just, no, man, I'm good. I'll stay here. Because to me, it's just kind of a crazy doctrine to think that Christ is in hell giving people a chance to get saved because everybody would take that chance. And so what kind of a thing is that? You know, like everybody's just getting a free pass at that point. And so, you know, sorry, when you're in hell, you're screwed at that point and you don't get another chance. And we shouldn't give people a false hope that says, hey, there's this other chance that you might have to get saved after you're dead. No, you better get saved. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. I think that Christ and Noah, you know, both through the power of the Holy Spirit, preached to people before they died. And again, you know, I can't really do justice to the question in a matter of minutes. So I would point you to, you know, the sermon that I preached. I also did a series, if you want something more recent, because I always believe that my more recent preaching is always better and more accurate than older preaching. You know, I did sermons on 1 Peter 3 and 1 Peter 4 specifically. I don't remember which one I really delved into this, but I'm sure one of those is going to delve into it. So.
Yeah, I think those are some great thoughts. And I think when we talk about the idea of Jesus going to hell, there's some really clear passages that talk about that or actually bring that up specifically, and they don't mention any of this stuff. And when you look at 1 Peter chapter 3, it's very clear that the context of the passage is about suffering for righteousness' sake. And I think that that's the key you kind of have to keep in mind when reading these verses, is that that's the general context that's being described as the importance of suffering. Because it says in verse number 14 of chapter 3, but if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye. And so it's definitely emphasizing the suffering. In verse 18, it says, for Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. So, you know, if you take verse 18, it's just saying Christ suffered against unjust people. He suffered for righteousness' sake by being put to death. But notice at the end of this verse, it also brings up, but he quickened by the Spirit. So if I'm going to jump into the context of this in verse number 19 and bring up hell, that seems a little bit out of order, Because think about it. It's talking about him dying and then resurrecting. And then now all of a sudden I'm going back to when he was in hell. That's not really fitting that chronology. So I definitely agree that verse 19, it's not talking about him going to hell at all. It's bringing up another instance how Christ suffered for righteousness' sake, is my opinion. So one way he suffered for righteousness' sake is that he was put to death. Another way that he suffered for righteousness' sake is, I believe, just preaching to unsaved people. And that these people, like it's to some degree frustrating, and there's persecution associated with a lot of the people that he preached to. I mean, think about it. He came into his own, and his own received him not. That's, in a sense, a suffering that he had to go through. And I believe that the prison is in reference to people being unsaved. You could think about verses that talk about he led captivity captive. You could think about the fact that the devil, I was thinking of a verse where it brings up how in 2 Timothy chapter 2, and that they may recover themselves of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. So there's some level of captivity that's associated with being unsaved or being under the power and influence of the devil. And I believe that could be in reference to them being in prison. And so it's just talking about Jesus preaching to people under the power and influence of the devil. And that was a part of his suffering. In verse 20, it says, which sometime were disobedient. Again, I think that that's just in reference to the idea of Ephesians chapter 2, how everyone that's under the power and influence of the devil is considered a child of disobedience. And I think why it ties in Noah, because again, this is a difficult passage, but I think why it ties in Noah specifically is just the fact that both of them kind of faced a crowd of hostility. Because if you think about it, just saying like only 8 people were saved with Noah. Like the vast majority of people didn't receive Noah's message. And I think that's kind of similar to maybe how Jesus Christ, in the grand scheme of things, most of the Jews rejected his message. And so they both kind of have this tie-in of suffering for righteousness' sake. And I think that that's the general context. To try and derive a preaching to unsaved people in hell is really just a strange view that's not found anywhere in the text. And they're trying to take a hard passage and bring that to the text. 'Cause I don't think anybody would read this and then think that. Like, I don't think anybody would read this and believe that.
Let's just say for argument's sake that, you know, Jesus did preach to people in hell. Let's just say, yeah, this is saying that Jesus, you know, after he died on the cross, he descended into hell and he preached to these people in hell who were disobedient, you know, while the ark was being prepared. Well, then, you know, I wouldn't believe for one second that those people got saved. Like you could just make a case that he said stuff to them, but there's no way that those people are now being given an opportunity to be saved. They had their chance. Noah preached to them. Like, right. That's what they have to respond to.
They had Moses and the prophets. I mean,
yeah,
again,
because if Jesus shows up preaching to them and they're being given an opportunity to be saved after they're dead, after they're in hell, that creates all kinds of theological problems. And the thing about that is that anyone would accept it. You'd have to be insane to be like, no, I know I've been in hell for, you know, thousands of years. I've been burning in hell, but I just want to stay. That's just stupid. Like this idea doesn't really work.
Yeah, the rich man
The
rich man wanted to be saved, and you know he's hoping that people would get saved that you know haven't died yet. But you know Abraham's clear. Like even though one rose from a dead, neither will they be persuaded. And he says they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. Now, of course, the people in Noah's day didn't have Moses yet, but they still had prophets. I mean, Enoch was a prophet. Obviously, some of the Bible was obviously accessible to these people and maybe just oral form. I don't know. But it's not like they were void of God's word completely. And Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So they had the gospel being preached to them. They rejected it. And now they're not going to have any chance. I mean, after death, the theological position is no one can be saved. I mean, there's a great gulf fixed. No one can pass here and there. I mean,
yeah. And speaking of the rich man who's burning in hell, right? He's a believer. I mean, like now that he's burning in hell, he's like, wow, you got to go talk to my family. You know, he doesn't need convincing. He's already there, man. But does that get him out of hell?
Right. It's almost like if Jesus were to go to hell and preach the gospel, they can't get saved. So it's like adding insult to injury because it's like, hey, I'm out of here in 3 days and 3 nights. So, but you guys can't get saved, but here's the gospel. It's kind of doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Yeah. And if someone wants to believe that while Jesus was burning in hell, he preached to those people, I think that that's viable as long as you don't come up with this goofball doctrine that says, oh, he's getting them saved. That's almost like the Mormon doctrine, because I just preached a whole sermon about the Mormon doctrine of baptisms for the dead on last Wednesday night. That's what I preached on. And that's what the Mormons are saying. They're saying, hey, look, after people die, they're being given another chance to get saved. And that's why we're doing these baptisms for dead people, because we're getting them like another chance to be saved. There is no other chance to be saved, my friend. You get saved before you die, or you are going to face eternal damnation. It's that simple. And no matter what passage somebody wants to twist to try to make you think that there's a second chance, there is not another chance after you're dead. When you're dead, it's over for you, my friend. And people that are in hell, they're going to be in eternal torment. So
this is your chance. And, from a theological perspective, the Bible's clear that we're saved by faith. So here's the thing. Them in hell, now they're not being saved by faith. They're being saved by sight. Well, that's not really how you get saved anyways. You have to be saved by faith in Jesus Christ. And, this is our opportunity to believe in him. Now, not when you're standing in front of the judge and saying, oh, now I believe in you, that it's evident and I don't even have to have faith anymore. It's like, well, that that destroys the whole essence of what the gospel is. The gospel is putting your faith in Jesus Christ and believing the gospel. And that's what gives God honor and glory, not just, oh, now I believe it because I just don't want to burn in hell. Like that's the total, that totally messes up the whole point of why God even created the gospel and every part of it. So thanks so much for your question. Again, 1 Peter chapter 3, the end portion is definitely a hard passage of scripture. It's definitely not necessarily one of the easiest passages. Even if we play devil's advocate, it still doesn't go the dispensational route, but I think it's clearly just talking about, I agree with Pastor Anderson, just talking about unsaved people. Let's see if we can bring on another caller. Before I do, I just want to plug again. We do have a show this Thursday. We've had a lot of people watching the show live. We want you to come and watch us on Thursday, the Red Heifer Debate. Pastor Jimenez and I am going to be going against a Jew and a Jew sympathizer on the Red Heifer, on Judaism. Are we bringing in the Messiah or the Antichrist? And for those of us that are saved, we already know the answer to that one. But I think it's going to be a lively discussion. Ben's going to be moderating for us. I know it's very easy for you to be neutral on this subject. So,
well, I will just draw inspiration from when Pastor Anderson was sitting there talking to the rabbis and restraining, and so I will do so and call it right down the middle.
Great. So Pastor Anderson's going to take just a quick break, but I do want to address, what is it?
I just wanted to say, and I know this doesn't add much, but really appreciated how you guys expounded that passage there.
Okay.
1 Peter
chapter 3.
Really
Great.
Liked it.
Give me your thoughts on that real quick.
I would say that it's just, like you guys were saying, that the spirits in prison are unsaved people. And just as a follow-up, what about the idea that those who are unsaved are in bondage in the sense of like they're in bondage to sin? And when you get saved, you're freed from sin. So maybe that's another aspect, potentially.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of symbolism. Obviously, Egypt was kind of like a prison. Egypt kind of pictures the carnal.
Yeah.
So, I think, Romans chapter number 7 also kind of indicates that view of imprisonment in the old man,
right.
Like who shall deliver me from this body of death?
Yeah.
So, again, I think that prison is a metaphor for just the unsaved person, is a slave to sin, and it can be taken captive of the devil at his will, is what the Bible says. So, it's definitely a difficult passage, and I think when you read it in context, you have to fit, I believe, your interpretation to any passage within the context. So if you're just, you're talking about, hey, it's important to suffer in the flesh. Suffer in the flesh. What's the point of bringing up Jesus preaching to people in hell? Like he's not in the flesh. He would be in the spirit if you were going to even bring that up. Like it totally negates like what we're even talking about. Whereas if he's preaching to unsaved people in the flesh and they're unreceptive, hostile, persecuting him, whatever, then that correlates to what? Suffering in the flesh and going through persecution. And, it also, like Pastor Anderson brought up in chapter 4, it says in verse number 6, for this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the spirit. Meaning that the people, when they die and go to hell, and then they stand before God of the great white throne judgment, they don't have some excuse like, well, you gave them the gospel and they got saved, and we never got the gospel. We never got a chance. No, it's going to be, hey, everyone heard the gospel, saved and unsaved. You guys rejected it, whereas these people did accept it and were the evidence of the fact that God was fair and righteous and had good judgments. And they're basically the evidence of, free will of people rejecting the gospel. So I think that's kind of how you can understand the importance of also how we are going to go through suffering in the flesh. I mean, we're going to preach the gospel and not everyone's going to get saved. I mean, you would love to think that everyone gets saved or when you approach people, but the vast majority of people aren't interested in the gospel. And even when you do get to present the gospel, not every time does someone accept it. I do think it's a high percentage. I don't know. What do you kind of think is your percentage when you actually get to present the gospel? How often do you think that person usually accepts in that conversation?
The vast majority of the time.
Maybe upwards of 50%, maybe 60%.
More, maybe even 70, 80%.
Yeah,
I feel like. We've gone to a yellow background.
Perfect.
Here. So
he's a shining. He's been caught up to the transfiguration, and he's not. He's
you know what that tells me? It's time to get in business.
Yeah, I know.
Here we go. All right, next caller. Right?
Maybe we're in the end times. Let's go to another caller, Eli. I think we have on the line. Let's see if we can get Eli to ask his question from South Carolina. It looks like Eli, you on the line?
Yes, sir.
How's it going?
I'm doing good.
What part of South Carolina are you from?
I'm from Aiken, South Carolina.
Cool. What's your question for us?
Well, I originally had another question, but I had another one that came to mind to ask if that's okay.
Go for it.
So I was wondering, between there's a lot of doctrine that goes along with independent fundamental Baptists especially, that a lot of people believe, and they'll teach that in the Old Testament, people would have been saved a different way than people are now. And I was wondering where you kind of draw the line on that between determining which of those people that teach that would be actually saved and which of them are not saved teachers.
So you're just talking about dispensationalism, like maybe a hyper-dispensationalism? Is that kind of...
Yeah, kind of like the Ruckman view of it.
Well, here's... When it comes to determining whether or not someone's saved, sometimes I think that it's maybe like an unprofitable, quest. Because, like, there's some people in the Bible that I think it's like, not knowable. Like, you kind of wonder, like, is this person saved or not? And many times it doesn't really matter, because if someone's teaching any form of works salvation, like, I'm going to get away from them and have nothing to do with them and not promote them. Like, to me, like, Galatians is really clear. Like, any person that's preaching any other gospel than that which ye have received, let him be accursed. So, like, I preached a whole sermon on this called Within Range. And it's kind of based on the principle that, the priest was worried about the king being destroyed because the whole lineage of Judah was in jeopardy, and the king was very young. And he basically gives commandment unto his servants saying, hey, if anybody comes within range of this king, you just slay them, because we don't know what their intentions are. And so, like, from my perspective, it's like, I don't really care if this guy's saved or unsaved. If he's messing with the gospel, I'm just going to literally treat him the same. I'm going to treat him as an accursed person that I want nothing to do with, and I'm going to stay, as far away from them as possible. And I think someone that's in dispensationalism, I wouldn't necessarily go that far to say that they're like that. But if they're teaching like people are literally being saved by works, then yeah, I would call them a heretic and just basically have nothing to do with them. Whether or not they're saved is their problem. It's not really my problem. I don't know what you think on that, Pastor Anderson.
Yeah, I think that one of the key things to remember is that the vast majority of independent fundamental Baptists who say that they believe in dispensationalism believe that salvation is the same throughout all ages, that it's always by grace through faith. It's only a more radical minority that would say that people were saved by works in the Old Testament. So if your church is dispensational, don't freak out, because they're probably some kind of a watered down dispensationalism that still believes in salvation being the same in all periods. Now, I would say that, I'm afraid that everyone who's teaching this thing of, in the Old Testament, they were saved by their works, or again, in the future, during the tribulation, they'll be saved by their works or something. I fear that all of those people are unsaved, unfortunately, but I don't know. It's like Pastor Shelley said, that's kind of unknowable. I hope that I get to heaven and find out that God was just like way more lenient than I thought, and that there are just going to be a lot of people with really screwed up doctrine that God says, hey, it was close enough. You know what I mean? Like, because I want as many people to be in heaven as possible, but I'm afraid that it's not going to be like that. And that, we do have to believe that salvation is by faith, obviously. And these guys that are teaching that it was by works in the Old Testament, especially a pastor, somebody who's spent a lot of time studying the Bible. I mean, I could see, like, if a new believer got goofed up on that, there's probably a much bigger chance that they're still saved and that they're just confused. But somebody who spent years and years studying and reading the Bible, it kind of makes you question, do you even understand the gospel? Because if you think people could get saved by works back then, like, what in the world? Like, you think that a filthy rag used to get people saved? Because all our righteousnesses are filthy rags. Did they not used to be filthy rags back then? Like, what is that? And so when I hear that, I agree with Pastor Shelley that if somebody's that screwed up doctrinally, at that point, it might not hurt to just assume that person's unsaved. My mom taught me when I was a little kid. She actually said, if people are screwed up on doctrine and you just assume that they're not saved because they're so screwed up, you're not really hurting them, because if they turn out to actually be saved, they're still going to heaven, whether you consider them saved or not. But she said, if you wrongly assume that people are saved who actually are not saved, you actually might be hurting them, because if you just start assuming that everybody around you is saved, then you're probably not witnessing to them. You're probably not giving them the gospel, whereas you're not going to send people to hell number 2, if they're not saved and you assume that they're not saved. And if they are saved, we don't have the power, contrary to what some people believe, we don't have the power to reprobate people,
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, like, I agree with that, because Paul's kind of saying in Galatians, like, I'm afraid of you. And I think that's kind of the attitude that we should have. It's like, hey, I'm kind of afraid of you and afraid of your doctrine. Like, you might not even be saved here. I think, I'm trying to be more careful in the idea, like, I don't want to just reprobate people that don't have the obvious manifestations of a reprobate.
Faggots.
And yeah, of course they are. But again, like, so, it doesn't really matter, though, at the end of the day. And I agree with Pastor Anderson, like, this is probably a minority of even dispensationalists, not even just fundamental Baptists, probably a minority of even dispensationalists that kind of give lip service to this bizarre idea of multiple ways of salvation. Because I've seen a lot of independent Baptist websites that even say, like, we're dispensational, and then they have a big caveat, like, but we believe salvation is the same throughout all ages and everything. They want to be really clear because they don't want any kind of false accusation with that. But
let's be clear on something else, that the actual founders of dispensationalism, the fathers of dispensationalism, they did believe in that screwed up, salvation is different at different times, which is part of why we should totally reject their teachings.
Right. It's like Calvinism and limited atonement. It's like they all want to get away from limited atonement, but it's like that's what they believed.
Well, and there was a documentary on this a while back by Pastor Mejia called, I think, A Dispensation of Heresy.
Yep.
And in that documentary, I'm pretty sure it kind of goes into the history and quotes these guys and shows how they were teaching different modes of salvation. And so, this kind of compromise view that says, well, we're dispensational, but we don't accept the different modes of salvation. It's just like, just throw out the whole dang thing, because it's just stupid and unbiblical anyway.
Well, thanks so much for your question, Eli. Thanks for calling in. I want to go I want to go to another caller. Let's see if we can get Daryl on the line from upstate New York. Or I don't know where he's from. What part of Long Island, Manhattan? Where are we at?
Your neck of the woods.
No. I'm in Western New York. I'm in Buffalo, New York.
Oh, so he's not like them kind of people.
Listen, guys. It's a real privilege to talk to you guys. And I watched and listened to all you guys preach and expound the scriptures. So you guys are great. But if you don't mind me asking, I want to first preface my question by just laying out the words 3.5 years. The reason why is because I go to an IFB church, okay, and everybody's talking about the Middle East wars and what's going on, and how the rapture is going to happen any minute, and it's imminent return of Christ, and all this, and I'll sit there and I'll just be quiet, I'll listen, and I'll try to let them say what they want to say, because they're all pretty much Fox News Christians, and they don't really know what's really going on over there. I watch like Al Jazeera TV on YouTube, and it's pretty horrific and barbaric what's going on over there as far as what the Jews are doing to the Palestinians over there. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked. But what I want to ask is, when the 3.5 years happens, okay, is it from the abomination of desolation? And that's when the rapture is going to occur 3.5 years later? Or is it something that happens before that we wait for the abomination of desolation to happen 3.5 years later?
Well, it kind of looks like Pastor Anderson is being raptured, so he could probably answer this question pretty easily. But the 3.5 years is usually coming from a couple different places in the Bible, like it brings up time, times, and half a time. That's kind of where you get an idea of 3.5 years, or 1,260 days is mentioned a few times in Scripture as well. So, but that's kind of showing like a midpoint of a 7-year cycle, or what's referred to as Daniel's 70th week. And it appears very clearly in the text that the midpoint is the abomination of desolation. And the Bible then describes a period of great tribulation, and then there will be a rapture event. Now, I believe Pastor Anderson's chart, if you get one, it has you can just literally just type in Google, usually just like Daniel's 70th week, Stephen Anderson. It's usually like one of the top links you can find his chart. He shows that he believes and places that timeline about 75 days from the midpoint of that 70th week. And there's a lot of, actually there's like whole sermons he's done on this with all kinds of great indications, like different kinds of symbolism and shadowing and pictures about why he kind of comes at that specific timeline. But I agree. I think it's very reasonable to think that that's a realistic timeline, considering the fact that, the wrath portion has to take a serious amount of time. I mean, the Bible brings up the idea of there being locusts tormenting men for a long portion of time, and there's all these different wraths being poured out. So if that's going to happen in that 3.5 year period of time, well, of course, then the rapture has to happen, within somewhat of a short space. So I'm going to let Pastor Anderson kind of comment on where he comes up with the 75-day figure, but I agree with him.
Yeah, so as you said, there's a 7-year period that people typically refer to as Daniel's 70th week because of the fact that it's foreshadowed in the book of Daniel. And the thing about that is that at the midpoint of that, so there's 3.5 years before, 3.5 years after, that's where the abomination of desolation takes place. Now, many people who believe in a post-trib, pre-wrath rapture would simply say that the rapture takes place at an unspecified time during the second half of Daniel's 70th week, because we know that at the midpoint, with the abomination of desolation, that's where tribulation intensifies specifically for believers. And that's the mark of the beast, and Christians are being persecuted. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So the Antichrist is not allowed to fully implement the mark of the beast for the full 3.5 years of his reign, because, it's cut short by Christ coming in the clouds, the rapture. So your typical, before I came along, your typical post-trib pre-wrath chart usually showed an unspecified period of time, that just the rapture takes place sometime in that second half of Daniel's 70th week. I mean, that's a valid viewpoint. But I believe that there's just so much evidence in Scripture pinpointing this really specific time, approximately 75 days after the midpoint, that I do believe that the Bible is pointing us to that time as when the rapture takes place. And I have done whole sermons on this. One sermon where I talked about it was called Jesus Walking on the Sea. That's kind of an older one. There's another more recent sermon called The Timing of the Rapture. And I'm pretty sure my sermon called The Timing of the Rapture is kind of the best one that I've done, or most up to date. I hope I'm not wrong. But I think that sermon, I go into in great detail the 1,335 days and all of these different pictures of it throughout the Bible. So, yeah, I do believe that it specifically takes place like the rapture takes place like 2.5 months after the midpoint. But again, a lot of post-trib pre-wrath charts out there just kind of leave it open-ended, that it's just, they know it happens sometime in that second half, but they're not, pinning it down to like 2.5 months. But I have a lot of good reasons for believing that. It's not like I'm basing that on one verse. I'm basing it on like a lot of passages. So
cut me off if I get this wrong. I just want to say real quick, the picture that you brought up in your sermon, Pastor Anderson, about the Hebrew calendar year made me fall off my chair. The Day of Atonement, when it occurs during the year of Jubilee, picturing the rapture and lining up perfectly with Daniel's 70th week. I just thought that was amazing.
Well, I'll tell you this. I figured all that out while I was preparing the Revelation series that I did back in 2013, that I know a lot of people have watched, the big Revelation series that we did with Framing the World, Paul Wittenberger, back in 2013. I put a lot of thought and effort into that series because I really wanted it to be something special. And people come up to me, pretty much every month talking to me about it. And thankfully, people are still watching it. And I wanted it to be something that I could still recommend, 10, 11 years later. So I really did my homework. And I'm telling you, that was something that I really wanted to understand about that whole, you shall have tribulation 10 days and all these different things. And I'll tell you, when that all clicked for me, because it all clicked for me like within a space of like 15 minutes. Obviously, it's a culmination of like thousands of hours of Bible study. But I'm saying like once one thing clicked, then like 3 other things clicked. And I have to say, it was one of the greatest moments of my life. I feel like it was so exciting just to see so many scriptures line up. And then since then, other people have written into me and showed me other proofs that I'd never even thought of. And so now I've just like accumulated all this proof about it. And it's interesting.
Yeah,
it's really
the
cool.
distance of them like traveling across the water and then they just immediately appear at the other side. That was a pretty cool one too.
Jeconias being also brought out of prison.
That was a good one too.
So
he's brought up to dine with the king and everything.
I think that was someone sent in, wasn't it? Later.
It was, yeah.
If I'm understanding correctly, Pastor Anderson, were you saying that the position we hold to, that the rapture happens 75 days after the midpoint, which you brought up the biblical proof for that. You've got Daniel 12:12. You do the math, 1,335 minus 1260. But my point is that, if I heard you correctly, the minority view amongst people who believe the post-trib, pre-wrath position?
Well, I don't know if it is anymore.
Oh, okay.
Because obviously a lot of people have been influenced by that Revelation series that's literally been viewed by millions of people, literally millions of people viewed after the tribulation. I mean, the Spanish version alone was viewed like 15 million times. The English version was like well over 5 million views just on one upload of After the Tribulation. So I think that my teachings have had an influence. I don't really know how many people have kind of come over to my view or if any. I don't know if any people who were already post-trib pre-wrath have come over to my view. But obviously, if you walk into a Baptist church and say, I'm post-trib pre-wrath, your old IFB pastor is going to ask you a question next and say, like, so you listen to Pastor Steven Anderson?
There's a Tempe cult somewhere.
Yeah. Well, But obviously, post-trib pre-wrath was, of course, around before I came along, and it'll be around after I'm gone. I'm not claiming to have invented any of this. I'm just saying that before I came along, if you just Googled this or looked at the main books that taught it or the main charts that were out there, it was just kind of this unspecified time. Obviously, now my charts are out there. My documentaries, my preaching's out there. Perhaps, now a lot more people that are post-trib pre-wrath are have come over to my view. I don't know. Maybe my view is still a minority view. Maybe it's not anymore. I just don't know. But I'm just saying, before I came along, that seemed to be the most prevalent view, was that it was just an unknown point in the second half of Daniel's 70 week. That was like the typical post-trib pre-wrath view. And then there's another post-trib pre-wrath view that Dr. Roland Rasmussen had taught. And, Kent Hovind has parroted because he's never had an original thought in his life except dumb stuff that's retarded. But anyway, that other view that Dr. Rasmussen had was that basically, it's post-trib pre-wrath, but that the wrath comes after the 7 years is over. And I have great respect for the late Dr. Roland Rasmussen. He was a super smart guy and had a lot of great sermons against the pre-trib rapture. But I disagree with that view. I think he was incorrect about that. And so those are the two views that I've seen, like where they're post-trib pre-wrath, but they still believe the tribulation is 7 years. And then the view that it happens at some unspecified point in the second half of Daniel's 70th week. Those are the two views that I have seen the most before I came along. But now the view that I see the most is my view, just because of the fact that, we've reached a lot of people with this. So,
do we still have Daryl on the line? I'm curious if you had any thoughts about our answers here.
So I think it was really good. As far as the 3.5 years, though, I was wondering, now the 3.5 years, is this before the abomination of desolation? Maybe I didn't hear this right. I want to listen to that sermon that says an earlier sermon, Pastor, if you could rename that again for me.
The timing of the rapture?
The timing up to the 3.5 years, does it lead up to the abomination of desolation? Is that what it is?
So you basically have 3.5 year time periods. So you kind of have a 7 year period, and it's basically 1,260 days, and then you have that midpoint, which is the abomination of desolation. Then you have another 1,260 days. But because of the way the Jewish calendar works, you actually have another 30 days that's tagged in at the very end. So it's 1,290. And so, but it's basically just a time times and half a time, which is 3.5 years approximately, or 42 months is the Bible. So the Bible has a lot of different ways of actually describing that time period. And I think if you look at my end times chart, or if you look at Pastor Anderson's end times chart, it'll show you some of the verses that indicate those time periods and why we're coming to those conclusions. I don't even think you need the book of Daniel to come to those same conclusions, but it definitely fits perfectly as well. And so hopefully that answers your question. Thanks so much for calling in, Daryl. I'm going to go ahead and get to another caller here, and we still have lots of people on the line. I want to see if we can get Ted from Minnesota, and we got a lot of Northerners here calling in. Ted, I don't know if we got you on the line. Can you hear us?
Oh, yeah.
How's it going?
How you doing?
Don't you know? We got Ted on the line, don't you know? From Minnesota.
I know, from Minnesota. The snowy place. I got to get you guys up here sometime for a Bible conference.
Well, we had a Minneapolis marathon.
I know, that was probably, 5 years ago or something?
Yeah, it was a while back. I had to stay at the Mall of America more than I wanted.
Yeah, I tried to get to that thing. I was tied up, but anyway. I followed you guys for years. I just wanted to say I appreciate everything you guys have done. Congratulations to Pastor Shelley on getting a new building, where I know you've had problems.
Thank you.
With the people breaking windows and all that stuff, so forth.
Yeah.
I followed you, Pastor Anderson, ever since the days of the Border Patrol, and love some of your videos on that too, by the way. I I got one of these things that's just kind of been sitting in my mind for 10 years. It's not really a big thing. Just more of an English trying to understand something, and this goes way back. You preached a sermon talking about the children that Mary had, and you mentioned the brothers of Jesus, and it talks about it and names the names of Jesus' brothers, and then the sisters, and it says, "Are they not all here with us?" And what you have brought up in that is that she had 8, at least, which you mentioned like 3 sisters. And I'm just curious, I've been trying to think how they went from a minimum of 2 up to a minimum of 3 in the English language. And I just can't seem to figure out how to get up to 3 on that number. And I'm just kind of curious if you can kind of illuminate my mind a little bit and
Sure.
Fill me in if you remember how that sermon went, or
yeah, I do remember. It's not the word "they" that's the operative word there. It's the word "all." So typically, the word "all" would not refer to 2 people because you would use the word "both." So what I was saying is that if it says his sisters, are they not all with us? It doesn't say they're both with us or something. It says they're all with us, and typically all would be 3 or more. A lot of languages in this world have singular, plural, and dual. Biblical Hebrew is like that. It has not just singulars and plurals, but also has dual. And Homeric Greek is like that. The Bible doesn't use dual forms in the New Testament, but you could still have obviously words like 2 or both and things like that. So my point was that typically when we use the word "all," we're referring to 3 or more, because you wouldn't say all 2 of them, all 2 of us. You'd say all 3, all 4,
right,
all 5, but you would never say all 2. So the way that I did the math there is that the Bible lists by name 4 brothers of Jesus.
Right.
That's 4. And then you have Jesus himself. And then his sisters are not they all with us. Yeah. So now the Roman Catholics, what they would say is they would turn around and say, well, when it says brothers there and sisters, it's not a literal brother. It's more like relative, which obviously sometimes the Bible does use the word brother in the sense of just relative. And it could be a nephew, an uncle, a cousin. It could be anything. But the problem with that interpretation is that we have so much other evidence that Mary and Joseph had children. For example, it says he knew her not until she brought forth her firstborn son. So after she brought forth her firstborn son, then he knew her. We don't believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. Joseph and Mary got married. And, a marriage where people don't have sex is not a legitimate marriage, number one. Okay. It has to be consummated in order for the marriage to be real. And then the other thing is that she brought forth her firstborn son. And we have 2 different scriptures that bring up the fact that Jesus is the firstborn son. It'd be like if you had a movie that was called Part 1, you're expecting a Part 2. You're not just going to have Part 1 and nothing else. And so if you have a firstborn son, then the implication is that there are going to be other sons after that. Now, of course, the modern versions, based on corrupt manuscripts like Vaticanus, remove the word firstborn from Matthew chapter 1. It's, and you can see how someone could have a motive to do that, just like you can see a motive for removing Acts 8:37. Acts 8:37 is teaching that you have to believe on Jesus Christ before you get baptized. Well, that's not going to work for Roman Catholic or even Protestant infant baptism. And so you can see a motive where someone would take out a verse that's inconvenient for their doctrine, take out the word firstborn and say, wait a minute, it's not her firstborn son, it's her only son because she stayed a virgin and whatever. And so I think that when you just look at all the evidence, he knew her not until firstborn son, this guy's the brother of the Lord, these are his brethren, his sisters, are they not all with us? And then you just use common sense that if Mary and Joseph got married, they have to have sex or they're not really married. The Catholics are full of baloney.
Yep.
One thought, and again, I don't know because I've never even really considered if it was 2 or 3 sisters, but maybe it's possible that the all is referring to the brothers and sisters, so it could still technically be 2 and fit. Because I agree with you from a grammatical sense, you wouldn't say all with 2. I think both might make sense, but if the all is referring to all the brethren, then perhaps it was just 2. But again, at this point, like of contention, Catholics aren't wondering if he has 7 or 8 siblings. They believe in a perpetual, eternal virgin that ascended into heaven. They say that Joseph took a vow of celibacy, and it's just like, it's just so bizarre. So
I mean, it's so insane what they literally teach that even before Mary and Joseph were visited by their respective angelic visitors, that they were never planning on having sex. That this whole marriage was always going to be one with no sex involved. And you know what? That's not marriage. And they're like, oh, well, back then that was a thing. On what planet was that a thing?
Well, I heard the Catholics say they were doing that because they wanted to become the Mary and Joseph. Like, people were just deciding, like, I'm going to be celibate and hope that God will pick me as being the Mary or the Joseph or some nonsense.
Yeah, these are the same type of teachings as people who tell you, like, oh, yeah, Muhammad, married a 9-year-old, but that was normal back then. It's like they just make up this stupid, weird, or oh, back then girls got married when they were 12 and that was normal. Oh, they used to breastfeed babies till they were 5 or 6 years old. If you actually start to study ancient history, and I've studied a lot of ancient history, I've read a lot of ancient literature, here's what you find out, that these teachings have no actual evidence backing them at all. They're just made up after the fact, and they're mentioned literally centuries or even more than 1,000 years after the fact. They're telling you what things were like 1,000 years ago. That'd be like if I said, well, here's what it was like in 1100 AD. Here's what the culture was like. What in the world? I have no knowledge of that. I'm living in 2024. I would have to base it on something I read from back then. And guess what? There is no literature from back then teaching these stupid, bizarre things. And also, common sense should tell you that dudes aren't going around marrying women with no intention of having sex with them. That is just dumb.
Yeah, I don't know what the point is. I preached a sermon, the main reason men get married, and maybe you can reference that. But I will go. Well, thanks so much for calling in, and thanks for being a listener. Thanks for thinking about us and praying for us, and we'll consider Minnesota. Maybe it's the mall, evangelism extravaganza or something. They do have a roller coaster. They have roller coasters in the Mall of America. It's pretty cool that it's like indoors and everything like that. It's definitely a unique experience, but I just don't like malls. So
I think you have kind of a love-hate relationship with the Mall of America.
Yeah, that's true. It is true. I can stand it for about half a day, but then I get really done with it fast, I guess. Let's go ahead and see. I think we have another caller from Texas, Jackie, who we can see if we can bring on the line. She's been waiting a little while. Jackie, can you hear us?
Hey, how are y'all?
Thanks so much for being patient and calling in. Where are you from?
Mountain Home. It's out of Kerrville in the Hill Country.
What is that close to?
San Antonio.
Oh, okay. So what's your question for us this evening?
Well, I go to a really great soul-winning church. They're great on salvation, but they're pre-trib. What is a good way to approach the pastor? Maybe not me as the wife, but maybe my husband. I don't know. To have a conversation about the things that we differ in.
I mean,
could I
here's
give
the best way to do it. The best way to do it is not to do it.
Okay.
Because honestly, you should just be happy that you have a good church, soul winning. A lot of people, unfortunately, get really emotional about that issue. The information's already out there. Your pastor's probably heard it before. If your pastor's interested and researches it, he's going to find the information. It's in the Bible. Our teachings are out there. Other people's teachings are out there. I don't think it's worth it over such a a minor issue that in the scheme of things is not the most important thing at all. And I know that in some ways it's like, that was our big film after the tribulation. And, you know, I'm glad it was a big film. A lot of people got saved through the gospel presentation at the end of that film. I enjoyed making the film. I still think it's a great film. And I do believe that, you know, our end times views are correct and biblical, and I enjoy preaching them. But at the end of the day, that is like a really low level doctrine as far as being super important. There are a lot of other things that are way more important, and I don't think it's worth rocking the boat with your pastor. You know, if your pastor expresses an interest or expresses doubt about the pre-trib view and seems like he wants to talk about it or something, but just bringing that up to him is probably just asking for trouble. I would say just go with the flow. I'll put it this way. I went to pre-trib churches from the time I was 12, and I learned that the pre-trib rapture was false at age 12, to the time I was 24 and started Faith Forward Baptist Church. So 12, 13 years there, I went to churches that were pre-trib, and I never approached any pastor or any church leaders and tried to convert them on this. I just went to church, did my best to be a blessing, serve God, focus on the 99% that we agree on. And I don't think it's a good idea to confront your pastor about this, or your husband, or anybody.
Yeah, I would second that. And again, you know, this issue specifically, when we talk about the timing of the rapture, for whatever reason, it's a big deal to a lot of these people. And it's not just a big deal to your pastor. It's a big deal to a lot of fundamental Baptists. And for them, you know, coming out and saying like they're post-trib could be a big deal, like change a lot of things about their friendships, their associations, even maybe some of the members of their church. And so it's not just like, you know, having a difference of opinion here. For some of these people, it definitely changes a lot about their church, their atmosphere, their friends, their relationships. Like, there's so much connected to that doctrine for some reason that I think you don't want to really strong arm a pastor on those issues, because he's going to have to kind of make that decision for himself, and he kind of going to have to want to make the decision for himself if he wants to even change on that particular position. I think, you know, again, I wouldn't even bring it up with other people. Obviously, you don't want to lie, and obviously you never, you know, I wouldn't, you know, if asked directly about it, say that I didn't believe it or something. But I went to a pre-trib church for over a year, believing that fully, and it never got brought up. No one brought it up to me, said something. And in fact, the church that I was going to, the pastor preached pre-trib for 3 months straight. And even like after the end of some of his sermons, he'd be like, no one can disprove anything that I've said. And, you know, I just obviously felt like he was like taunting me or something, even though he didn't know that I believed that way. But, you know, there were still good things about the church, and I was still able to get people saved. And I just don't think it would have been profitable for me to try and rock the boat. You know, obviously I think pastors do enjoy their members coming up to them, asking questions and talking about the Bible to some degree. But that issue specifically is so highly charged that I agree with Pastor Anderson. It's probably just not worth